Andy Mast was halfway through humiliating Sky in a language she didn't understand when the tattooed man in the corner spoke. The words came out in the same Sicilian dialect Andy had been using to mock her, but where Andy's pronunciation had been tourist perfect, this man's voice carried the weight of something ancient and absolute. Every syllable landed like a threat wrapped in silk. Andy's face went white. The woman in the red dress gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles pale against the cloth. And Sky realized, with sudden clarity, that the predator Andy had dismissed as trash ruining the aesthetic was about to teach him exactly how little his Princeton semester abroad had actually taught him. This is the story of how borrowed power learned it was never really his. 17 minutes earlier, Sky Miller had been polishing wine glasses and trying not to think about the foreclosure notice in her locker. The Obsidian's dining room smelled like leather-bound menus, aged whiskey, and the particular cologne wealthy men wear when they need everyone to know they've arrived. For Sky, though, it mostly smelled like desperation, the kind that came from being exactly $700 short of saving her mother's house with 4 days left to do it. She'd been working at the Obsidian for 11 months, long enough to recognize the dangerous ones on site. The entitled sons who treated service workers like props in their performance of superiority. The men who snapped fingers instead of making eye contact, who sent back perfectly prepared food just to watch someone scramble, who tipped in inverse proportion to how much trouble they'd caused. Andy Mast was all of those things wrapped in a blue suit that probably cost more than Sky's car. Vincent Cross, the general manager, had cornered her near the bar 20 minutes before Andy arrived. Table 17 just confirmed, VIP guest, Richard Mast's son. His expression had been carefully neutral, but his tone carried a warning. He has a history. I'm putting him in your section because you don't break. It wasn't a compliment. It was a calculated sacrifice. Now Andy sat at the center table with a woman whose red dress cost more than Sky made in a month, and he was ordering in rapid-fire Sicilian while watching Sky's face for signs of confusion with the satisfied smile of a cat that had cornered a mouse. What neither of them had noticed was the man at table 11. Sky had been polishing the same wine glass for 30 seconds longer than necessary when Vincent's voice cut through the ambient noise of the dining room like a blade through silk. Miller, a word. She set the glass down carefully on the bar's rubber mat, where it caught the overhead lighting and threw fractured rainbows across the polished mahogany. Her hands were pruned from the hot water she'd been using to hand-wash the delicate stemware, the kind that cost $200 apiece and couldn't be trusted to the industrial dishwasher in the back. The repetitive motion had become meditative over the past 11 months. Dip, scrub, rinse, dry, inspect for water spots, polish until the crystal sang when you tapped it. It was one of the few tasks in this place that didn't require her to smile or apologize or pretend she didn't notice when someone looked straight through her. Vincent stood near the host podium with his arms crossed, his expression carved from the same expensive marble as the floor. He was 43 but looked older, the way men do when they've spent their entire adult lives in proximity to wealth without ever quite touching it themselves. His suit was impeccable, always was, but if you looked closely, you'd notice the cuffs were fraying just slightly, the fabric showing the wear of someone who owned 3 good suits and rotated them religiously. He wore his thinning hair slicked back with product that smelled like bergamot and desperation, and he had a particular way of looking at the staff that made you feel like you'd already disappointed him before you'd even opened your mouth. Sky wiped her hands on her apron and crossed the floor, weaving between tables where conversations about quarterly earnings and vacation homes in Aspen created a constant white noise of privilege. She kept her shoulders back, her chin level, the way her mother had taught her. You walk into a room like you belong there, baby girl, and eventually people forget to question it. The memory made her throat tight, but she pushed it down, buried it beneath the professional mask she'd spent almost a year perfecting. Yes, Vincent. He glanced at his tablet, swiping through what looked like the evening's reservation list, his manicured finger moving with practiced precision. Table 17 just confirmed. They'll be here in 8 minutes. He looked up at her, and there was something in his eyes she couldn't quite read, not concern exactly, but a cousin to it. Wariness, maybe. Richard Mast and his son. The name landed like a stone in still water. Skye felt her stomach clench, that familiar twist of anxiety she'd learned to breathe through. Richard Mast owned half the city's skyline, had his name on buildings that blocked out the sun in neighborhoods where people like Skye used to be able to afford rent. But it was the son everyone in the service industry whispered about during shift changes. Andy Mast. The heir who'd never worked a day in his life, but treated every interaction like an audition for American Psycho. "I'll make sure everything's perfect," Skye said, her voice steady despite the way her pulse had kicked up a notch. Vincent's expression didn't change, but his voice dropped lower, taking on the tone he reserved for serious matters. "The son has a history. Complaints from staff at 3 other establishments in the city. Nothing formal. People don't tend to make waves when that much money's involved, but I've heard things. He likes to test people, see how far he can push before someone breaks." Vincent paused, seeming to consider his next words carefully. "You're one of my most reliable servers, Miller. You don't crack under pressure, and you don't let customers rattle you. That's why I'm putting them in your section instead of Ramon's." There was no compliment in his voice. This wasn't praise, it was strategy. Vincent was putting her in the line of fire because she'd proven she could take a hit without bleeding where anyone could see it. "I understand," she said, "because that's what you said when your manager told you that you were about to be someone's emotional punching bag for the evening." Vincent nodded, already turning his attention back to his tablet, the conversation over. "Table 17, 8 minutes. Make sure the roses are fresh." Skye returned to the bar and finished polishing the glass she'd abandoned, her movements automatic now. Her mind was elsewhere, stuck on the folded piece of paper currently residing in her locker downstairs, tucked into the pocket of her street clothes. The foreclosure notice. She'd received it 6 days ago, delivered by a man in a county uniform who'd apologized 3 times while handing it over, as if his discomfort could somehow soften the blow. The house on Oakmont Street. The house where her mother had planted tomatoes every spring in those ridiculous ceramic pots shaped like chickens. Where Skye had learned to make French toast on Sunday mornings, standing on a step stool because she couldn't reach the stove. Where her mother had died 18 months ago, slipping away on a Tuesday afternoon while Skye held her hand and promised her everything would be okay. $3,000. That's what stood between Skye and losing the last physical connection she had to the woman who'd raised her alone, who'd worked doubles at the hospital and still somehow made it to every school play, every parent-teacher conference, every moment that mattered. $3,000 by Monday morning, or the county would auction it off to the highest bidder, and some developer, probably someone like Richard Mast, would bulldoze it to put up condos with names like the Sterling or Oakmont Heights, erasing every memory baked into those walls. Skye had been saving for months, skipping meals, walking the 4 miles home instead of taking the bus, picking up every extra shift Vincent would give her. She'd managed to scrape together $2,300. She was close, so desperately, achingly close. But close didn't matter in the world of county tax collectors and foreclosure auctions. Close was still failure. She set the polished glass down and picked up another, her reflection warping across its curved surface. The woman looking back at her was tired. 26 years old, but with the particular exhaustion that comes from shouldering grief and financial ruin simultaneously. Her dark hair was pulled back in the tight bun the restaurant required, severe enough to give her a headache by the end of most shifts. Her uniform was spotless. She made sure of that, even though the fabric was starting to thin at the elbows from repeated washing. She'd learned early that appearing put together was half the battle in places like this, where the clientele judged you on everything from your posture to whether your shoes were scuffed. The front door opened, bringing with it a gust of cold November air and the low murmur of new arrivals. Skye didn't look up immediately. She'd learned that appearing too eager could be read as desperate, and desperate made people uncomfortable. Instead, she finished polishing the glass in her hands, set it down with the others, and took a breath that tasted like anxiety and determination in equal measure. Vincent caught her eye from across the room and gave a subtle nod toward table 17. They were here. Sky dried her hands one final time, smoothed down her apron, and stepped out from behind the bar. As she moved through the dining room toward table 17, she let her mind go blank, the way she always did before dealing with difficult customers. No thoughts about the foreclosure notice. No mental math calculating how many tips she'd need tonight to make her quota. No room for anything except the performance of being Sky Miller, professional server, woman without problems or needs, or a house she was about to lose. Just the smile, just the script, just surviving until closing time. Andy Mast moved through the Obsidian's entrance the way certain men move through spaces they believe exist solely for their benefit, with the unhurried confidence of someone who'd never been told to wait for anything in his life. He was 31 years old and looked like he'd been assembled by a team of stylists working from a mood board titled Insufferable Wealth. The blue suit he wore wasn't just expensive, it was aggressively so, the kind of garment that announced its price tag before its wearer opened his mouth. Italian wool, cut so precisely to his frame that it might have been sewn directly onto his body. The fabric caught the light as he moved, creating subtle shifts in tone from sapphire to midnight. His shirt beneath was crisp white, open at the collar in that calculated way that suggested casual sophistication, but had probably been deliberated over for 20 minutes in front of a mirror. His hair was dark and styled with the kind of product that cost more per ounce than Sky made in an hour, swept back from a face that would have been handsome if it weren't for the expression he wore. There was something predatory in the set of his jaw, the way his eyes moved across the room cataloging and dismissing in the same glance. He had the bone structure of old money and the entitlement of someone who'd never been denied access to anything, anywhere, at any time. A Rolex caught light on his wrist, not the subtle kind that whispered wealth, but the kind that shouted it, all gold and deliberate flash. Behind him, moving with considerably less certainty, was the woman in the red dress. She was younger than Andy by at least 5 years, Sky guessed, probably mid-20s, with the kind of beauty that required both genetic luck and significant financial investment to maintain. Her blonde hair fell in waves that had clearly been professionally styled within the last few hours, each strand falling exactly where it was meant to. The dress itself was a statement piece, crimson silk that clung to her body like it had been poured over her, with a neckline that dipped low enough to be daring without crossing into inappropriate for a venue like this. Diamond earrings caught the light every time she turned her head. Her heels were tall enough to bring her almost eye level with Andy, the kind of shoes that transformed walking into a performance. But there was something uncertain in the way she carried herself, a slight hesitation in her movements that suggested she wasn't entirely comfortable with the role she was playing tonight. Vincent materialized beside them with the supernatural timing of truly gifted hospitality professionals, his smile perfectly calibrated to convey respect without subservience. "Mr. Mast, welcome back to the Obsidian. Your father called ahead. We have your usual table prepared." Andy didn't look at Vincent when he responded. His eyes were scanning the dining room, evaluating, judging, finding everything slightly beneath his standards. "The usual table is by the wall," he said, his voice carrying the particular timbre of someone accustomed to being listened to. "We'll take the center table instead, the one by the fountain." Vincent's smile didn't waver, though Sky, watching from her position near the bar, saw the slightest tension enter his shoulders. The center table was reserved for the Castellanos, a couple who'd been members since the restaurant opened and who tipped like they were trying to personally fund everyone's retirement. They were due to arrive in 20 minutes. "Of course, Mr. Mast," Vincent said smoothly, already making mental calculations about how to handle the inevitable conflict. "Right this way." Andy finally glanced at Vincent, and there was something dismissive in the look, as if he were confirming that yes, the staff would rearrange the entire evening to accommodate his whim, as he'd known they would. He placed a hand on the small of his date's back, possessive rather than affectionate, and guided her through the dining room. Other diners looked up as they passed, some with recognition, others with simple curiosity about who commanded such obvious attention. The woman in the red dress smiled nervously at other guests as they walked, a social reflex that Andy didn't share. He moved through the space like everyone else was part of the decor, present but not particularly worthy of acknowledgement. When they reached the center table, he pulled out the chair for his date with a flourish that seemed designed more for the audience of surrounding tables than for her benefit. She sat, smoothing her dress, and murmured something too quiet for Sky to hear from across the room. Andy didn't respond, already lowering himself into his own chair with the casual grace of someone who'd never worried about anything as pedestrian as whether a seat would hold him. Vincent gestured subtly to Sky, the universal signal that meant, your table, your problem, good luck. Sky picked up 2 leather-bound menus from the host's station, took a breath that was supposed to be calming, but mostly just made her more aware of how fast her heart was beating, and crossed the dining room. Her feet, already aching in their taped-together shoes, seemed to throb with every step. The walk felt longer than it should have, like she was approaching something that would hurt her, and her body was trying to warn her away. As she approached, she could hear Andy's voice, low and conversational, speaking to his date. You see the paintings on the walls? Reproductions. They pretend they're originals, but I can spot a fake from across the room. Father taught me that. Said half of luxury is just convincing people they're getting more than they paid for. The woman in the red dress made a small sound of agreement, though her expression suggested she hadn't been listening closely enough to form an actual opinion. Sky arrived at the table and positioned herself in the universal server stance, close enough to be accessible, far enough not to intrude, her body language carefully neutral. Good evening, she began, her customer service voice locked in place. Welcome to the Obsidian. My name is Sky, and I'll be. Andy held up one finger without looking at her. The gesture was so casual, so reflexive, that it was clear he'd been silencing people his entire life. The woman in the red dress glanced up at Sky with something that might have been sympathy or might have been second-hand embarrassment, but she didn't say anything. Sky stopped talking mid-sentence, her words dying in her throat. She stood there, menus in hand, while Andy finished whatever thought he'd been sharing with his date, something about a yacht club membership and how standards had declined. The seconds stretched. 15. 20. Sky remained frozen in place, her professional smile starting to ache at the corners, wondering if he'd forgotten she existed or if this was the test Vincent had warned her about. Finally, Andy turned his head and looked at her. Not at her face. His eyes went to her name tag first, lingering there long enough to read it twice. Then down to her apron, noting a small stain near the pocket that she'd tried to scrub out during her break, but hadn't quite managed to eliminate completely. Then further down to her shoes, those sad, scuffed flats held together with duct tape she hoped wasn't visible but probably was if you looked closely enough. And Andy Mast was the kind of man who looked closely enough to find flaws. His eyes traveled back up to her face, and when they met hers, there was nothing in them. No warmth, no acknowledgement of shared humanity, nothing that suggested he saw her as anything more than a particularly disappointing piece of furniture. You can set those down, he said, gesturing vaguely at the menus she was holding. We're not ready to order yet. Come back in 10 minutes. Not a question, not a request. A command delivered with the casual authority of someone who'd never had a command refused. The woman in the red dress shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her fingers playing with the stem of her empty water glass. Sky set the menus down on the table with careful precision, her hands steady despite the heat rising in her chest. Of course, I'll return shortly. The words came out smooth, professional, betraying nothing of what she was feeling. She turned to walk away, and that's when Andy spoke again, his voice just loud enough for her to hear, pitched for his date but calibrated to ensure Sky caught every word. Service isn't what it used to be in places like this. They'll hire anyone these days. Table 11 had been occupied for 47 minutes, and in that time, Mateo Reeves had spoken exactly 11 words to the staff. Water, no ice. The ribeye, rare, thank you. His voice, when he'd used it, had been quiet enough that Ramon had needed to lean in slightly to catch the order, and the senior server had approached the interaction like a man diffusing a bomb, careful movements, no sudden gestures, abundant caution in every syllable. Mateo sat with his back to the wall, a position he'd taken without being offered, simply walking past the host stand and claiming the corner table before Vincent could suggest an alternative. Nobody had argued. Vincent had watched him settle into the seat, made brief eye contact that seemed to communicate an entire conversation in a single glance, and then turned away to update the reservation system with trembling fingers on his tablet. The corner position gave Matteo a clear view of the entire dining room. Every entrance, every exit, the kitchen doors, the hallway leading to the bathrooms, the service station where servers congregated between tables. His dark eyes moved across the space with the methodical precision of someone conducting surveillance, though his body language suggested complete relaxation. He sat slightly reclined, one arm draped across the back of the empty chair beside him, the other resting on the table near his whiskey glass, which he'd been nursing for the past 20 minutes without refilling. The shirt situation had caused Vincent visible distress when Matteo first arrived. The Obsidian had a dress code: jacket required for men, formal attire expected, the kind of establishment where showing up in jeans would get you politely but firmly redirected to somewhere more appropriate for your aesthetic choices. But Matteo wore the rules the way he wore his blazer, loosely, and with the clear understanding that they didn't actually apply to him. The charcoal blazer was expensive, well-tailored across the shoulders in a way that suggested custom work rather than off the rack. But beneath it, instead of the expected dress shirt, buttoned to an appropriate height, Matteo wore what could generously be described as half a shirt. The black fabric was unbuttoned to the middle of his sternum, revealing a chest and neck covered in ink that seemed to move in the low light. The tattoos weren't the trendy kind that young professionals got on weekend trips to Brooklyn, small, meaningful symbols in discreet locations. These were the kind of tattoos that told stories, that marked territory, that meant something specific to people who knew how to read them. Dark geometric patterns wrapped around his collarbone and disappeared beneath the fabric. Script in what looked like Italian curved along the left side of his neck. Words Skye couldn't make out from her position across the room, but that seemed to carry weight in their very existence. On his right forearm, visible where his sleeve was rolled back, a detailed rendering of a wolf's head stared out with eyes that matched Matteo's own, dark, alert, missing nothing. Other images emerged and vanished as he moved. A crown, a saint's medallion, numbers that might have been dates or coordinates, all woven together in a tapestry that spoke of violence and heritage in equal measure. His hair was dark, almost black, and pushed back from his face in a style that suggested he'd run his fingers through it once and let it fall where it wanted. He had the kind of bone structure that photographers would kill to capture: sharp jawline, high cheekbones, a nose that had been broken at least once and had healed with a slight crook that only added to the overall impression of controlled danger. But it was his stillness that made him remarkable. While other diners gestured and laughed and performed their affluence, Matteo simply existed, as motionless as a predator waiting for prey to wander into range. The staff had been whispering about him since the moment he walked in. Skye had caught fragments of conversation between Ramon and the bartender, words like connected and respect, and don't ask questions. The kitchen staff, visible through the small window in the service door, had gone noticeably quieter when his order came through. The head chef had plated the rye by himself rather than delegating to one of the line cooks, unusual for a weeknight service. But Andy Mast, settling into his chair at the center table with his date in the red dress, saw none of this context. What Andy saw was aesthetic failure. A man dressed like he'd wandered in from some underground club where the dress code peaked at shirt optional. Someone whose visible tattoos and casual disrespect for formal dining conventions represented everything Andy found distasteful about the city's changing character. The kind of person who belonged in dive bars or motorcycle clubs, or whatever establishments catered to people who couldn't afford or appreciate true refinement. Andy noticed Matteo approximately 3 minutes after sitting down, his eyes catching on the unbuttoned shirt and the ink-covered skin, and his face arranged itself into an expression of mild disgust that he didn't bother to hide. He leaned toward his date, his voice pitched just loud enough to carry the few feet to where Matteo sat. "Standards really have declined," Andy said, his tone suggesting he was continuing a conversation from earlier rather than starting a new one. "Look at that. Tattoos on display like he's at a beach bar. Father would have a fit if he saw management letting in people dressed like criminals." The woman in the red dress followed Andy's gaze, her eyes widening slightly when she saw Matteo. She started to say something, her mouth opening, but Andy was already continuing. "Probably doesn't even belong here. Someone's guest, maybe. Or he knows someone on staff and they're letting him take up space." Andy picked up his water glass, examining it for spots with theatrical attention to detail. "These places used to mean something. Now they'll let anyone with a credit card pretend they're part of society." The woman shifted uncomfortably, and this time she did speak, her voice low and uncertain. "Andy, maybe we should just—" "I'm just saying what everyone's thinking," Andy interrupted, setting his water glass down with slightly more force than necessary. "Look at him, sitting there like he owns the place. Probably can't even afford the appetizers." What Andy didn't notice, because he was too busy performing his disdain for his date's benefit, was the way Ramon had stopped mid-stride on his way to another table, his face going carefully blank. Or how the sommelier, passing by with a wine bottle, had suddenly discovered an urgent need to return to the wine cellar. Or how Vincent, standing near the host podium, had closed his eyes briefly in an expression that looked like prayer or resignation. And Andy definitely didn't notice the way Matteo's hand, resting casually near his whiskey glass, had gone completely still. The subtle movement of his fingers tapping an idle rhythm against the table had ceased. His eyes, which had been conducting their methodical scan of the room, had locked onto Andy's table with the focused attention of a hawk spotting movement in tall grass. Matteo picked up his glass and took a slow sip, his expression unchanging. He set it back down with deliberate care, the crystal making no sound as it contacted the table. Then he cut into his ribeye, the knife moving through the rare meat with surgical precision, red juice pooling on the white plate. He chewed slowly, thoughtfully, his eyes never leaving Andy's table. To anyone watching closely, and several staff members were, with the horrified fascination of people witnessing the seconds before a car crash, Matteo looked perfectly calm. Relaxed, even. Just a man enjoying his dinner. Unbothered by the noise and movement of the dining room around him. But there was something in the quality of his stillness that had changed. The difference between a sleeping wolf and one that's opened its eyes and is calculating distance, trajectory, the precise amount of force required to close its jaws around a throat. Andy, oblivious, continued talking to his date about standards and decline, and how membership committees needed to be more selective about who they approved. His voice carried across the quiet dining room, each word another brick laid in a structure he didn't realize he was building around himself. Matteo finished his bite of steak, placed his knife and fork on his plate in the European style, and reached for his whiskey glass again. He held it up slightly, examining the amber liquid in the low light, watching how the chandelier above refracted through it. Then his eyes shifted, moving past the glass, past the other diners, landing with laser precision on Andy Mast's profile. And he smiled, just slightly, just enough to show teeth. It was not a friendly smile. The 10 minutes Andy had demanded passed with the excruciating slowness of water torture. Skye had busied herself with her other tables, refilling wine glasses and clearing appetizer plates, all while keeping one eye on the center table where Andy sat with his date, both of them now studying their menus with the intense focus of people preparing for an examination. She could see Andy's lips moving as he read, his finger tracing down the page, occasionally pausing to make some comment to his companion that elicited dutiful nods and practiced smiles. When the timer on her phone buzzed softly in her apron pocket, she'd actually set a timer, knowing that Andy was the type to notice if she returned at 9 minutes or 11. Skye smoothed down her uniform one more time and approached the center table. Her feet had progressed beyond aching into a kind of numb burning that she knew from experience would explode into full agony the moment she finally sat down after her shift. The foreclosure notice seemed to pulse in her locker downstairs like a second heartbeat, a constant reminder of exactly how much she couldn't afford to lose this job tonight. "Good evening," she said again, pulling out the small notepad she kept in her apron along with a pen that had the restaurant's logo printed on the side in gold leaf. "Have you had a chance to look over the menu?" Andy looked up at her, and there was something in his expression that made her stomach clench with preemptive dread. It was the look of a cat that had cornered a mouse and was now deciding exactly how long to play with it before the kill. He glanced at his date, who was watching him with rapt attention, clearly expecting some kind of performance, and then back at Skye. "We have," he said, drawing out the words. He shifted in his chair, angling his body toward his date while still addressing Skye, turning her into an audience member for whatever show he was about to put on. "But I have some questions first. This menu claims to serve authentic regional Italian cuisine, which I find fascinating given that most American restaurants wouldn't know authentic Italian if it walked through their door wearing a Venezia jersey." His date giggled, a high-pitched sound that seemed to require her to cover her mouth with perfectly manicured fingers. Skye kept her expression neutral, her pen poised over her notepad. "Our head chef trained in Bologna for 6 years, and we source many of our ingredients directly from Italy. I'd be happy to answer any specific questions you might have about our preparations." It was the script Vincent had taught her during training, the one designed to deflect food snobs without giving them ammunition. But even as the words left her mouth, she could see they'd been the wrong choice. Andy's smile widened, and there was nothing warm in it. "Bologna," he repeated, as if the word itself was amusing. "How cosmopolitan." He opened his menu again, making a show of studying it, his finger moving down the page with deliberate slowness. "Let me test that claim, shall we?" And then he started speaking, and the words that came out of his mouth weren't English. The language hit Skye's ears in a rapid-fire assault of unfamiliar sounds, harsh consonants and rolled R's that seemed to tumble over each other. She caught fragments that sounded vaguely Italian, something that might have been vino and another word that could have been pain. But the accent was aggressive, the cadence too fast, the overall effect completely disorienting. Andy spoke for what felt like 30 seconds, but was probably closer to 10, his voice rising and falling with theatrical emphasis, his free hand gesturing in broad movements that suggested he was describing something complex. When he finished, he closed the menu with a soft snap and looked at her expectantly, his eyebrows raised in mock patience. Skye's mind raced. The words had come too fast, the dialect too unfamiliar. She'd taken 2 years of Spanish in high school and could maybe order a coffee in broken French, but whatever Andy had just unleashed was completely beyond her linguistic capabilities. She could feel heat rising in her cheeks, that particular burn of public embarrassment that started in your chest and worked its way up to your face like a creeping infection. "I apologize," she said, her voice carefully controlled despite the way her heart was hammering. "I didn't catch all of that. If you could repeat it in English, I'll make sure." Andy cut her off with a laugh that wasn't quite cruel but was somewhere in the immediate neighborhood. "You didn't catch it," he repeated, his tone suggesting he was savoring the phrase. He looked at his date again, shaking his head in exaggerated disbelief. "She didn't catch it. I just asked, in fairly basic Sicilian, whether the brodo on your menu is made with the traditional 7 types of fish, or if you've Americanized it down to 3. It's not exactly advanced linguistic theory." The woman in the red dress was trying very hard not to smile, her lips pressed together in a way that suggested she was fighting the expression. She took a sip of her water to hide her face. "Sicilian," Skye repeated, buying herself time to think. Her throat felt tight, her professional composure starting to crack at the edges. "I'm not familiar with that particular dialect, but I can absolutely check with our chef about the brodo preparation." "Dialect," Andy interrupted, and now there was open condescension in his voice. "You call it a dialect, as if Sicilian is just some quaint regional variation." He leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms, the blue suit pulling perfectly across his shoulders. "I spent a semester in Palermo during my junior year at Princeton, lived with a family in the old city, learned the language properly, not the tourist trap Italian they teach at community colleges." Princeton? Of course it was Princeton. Skye felt something cold settle in her stomach, the realization that this wasn't going to be a simple, difficult table. This was going to be a masterclass in humiliation, orchestrated by someone who'd probably been planning this performance from the moment he saw her scuffed shoes. "I can certainly find someone who," she began, but Andy was already talking again, this time switching back to that rapid-fire cascade of unfamiliar words. He spoke longer this time, his voice taking on a professorial quality, as if he were delivering a lecture to an underperforming student. The words seemed to pour out of him with practiced ease, though there was something slightly off about his cadence, a hesitation here and there that suggested maybe his fluency wasn't quite as native as he wanted everyone to believe. He gestured at different items on the menu as he spoke, occasionally looking up at Skye to gauge her reaction, clearly enjoying the visible confusion on her face. Other diners at nearby tables had started to notice the scene. Skye could feel their attention like physical weight, the way conversations at table 15 had gone quiet, how the elderly couple at table 9 had turned slightly in their chairs to get a better view. This was becoming a spectacle, and she was the main attraction. When Andy finally stopped speaking, he set the menu down and folded his hands on the table, looking at her with an expression of exaggerated patience. "So, can you answer the question, or should I ask to speak with someone who actually understands what they're serving?" Skye opened her mouth, then closed it. Her notepad felt heavy in her hand, the blank page mocking her. She had no idea what he'd just said. No clue whether he'd asked about food at all, or if he'd just been reciting random phrases designed to make her feel stupid. The professional mask she'd been wearing was starting to slip. And she could feel the dangerous prickle of tears behind her eyes, not from sadness, but from pure, helpless frustration. "I apologize," she said again, and she hated how small her voice sounded. "I don't speak Sicilian. If you could order in English, I can make sure you get exactly what you're looking for." Andy's smile was triumphant. He turned to his date, speaking in English now, his voice pitched to Carrie. "See, this is exactly what I was talking about earlier. Places like this advertise authenticity, charge premium prices, and then staff their dining room with people who can't even understand basic questions about the menu. It's false advertising, really." The woman in the red dress nodded, though there was something uncertain in her expression now, as if she was starting to realize that what had seemed like charming confidence was maybe something uglier. Skye stood there, pen still poised over paper, feeling the weight of every eye in the room, knowing that Vincent was probably watching from somewhere nearby, and calculating whether this was going to turn into the kind of scene that required managerial intervention. The foreclosure notice burned in her consciousness. $3,000. 4 days. She couldn't afford to walk away, couldn't afford to tell Andy exactly what she thought of his performance. So she waited, her professional smile rebuilt with visible effort, for Andy to finish savoring his victory and condescend to order in a language she could actually understand. Skye swallowed against the tightness in her throat and forced herself to meet Andy's eyes, though it felt like staring into the face of something venomous. Her grip on the pen had gone white-knuckled, and she made a conscious effort to relax her fingers before she snapped it in half. The notepad in her other hand remained stubbornly blank except for the table number she'd written at the top. Around them, the dining room had taken on that peculiar quality of pretended normalcy, other guests returning to their conversations with slightly too much enthusiasm, their voices pitched just loud enough to suggest they weren't listening, while their body language screamed that they absolutely were. "If you would like to order in English," Skye said, each word carefully measured, "I can ensure your meal is exactly to your specifications. We pride ourselves on accommodating all of our guests' preferences." It was another line from Vincent's training manual, page 12, under the heading Dealing with Difficult Patrons. She could practically see the text in her mind, remain professional at all costs. Give them no ammunition. Do not engage emotionally. Your job is to serve, not to be right. Andy tilted his head, studying her with the clinical interest of someone examining an insect under glass. "You know what's fascinating," he said, his voice taking on a conversational tone that was somehow worse than the outright condescension, "is the complete lack of curiosity. Here I am, offering you a chance to learn something, to expand your cultural horizons, and instead you just want me to dumb it down for you." He tapped his finger against the menu. That's the problem with service workers these days. No ambition, no desire to be anything more than what they are. The woman in the red dress shifted in her seat, her champagne-colored clutch moving from the table to her lap, though her eyes remained fixed on Andy, with the rapt attention of someone watching a performance they'd paid good money to see. Skye felt something hot and dangerous rise in her chest, a wave of anger so pure it momentarily drowned out the fear of losing her job, the anxiety about the foreclosure, the exhaustion of her aching feet. For a crystalline second, she imagined what it would feel like to tell Andy Mast exactly what she thought of him, to inform him that his semester in Palermo didn't make him cultured. It made him a tourist with a superiority complex. That his ability to speak a language she didn't know wasn't a sign of his intelligence, but rather a reflection of the economic privilege that had bought him that education, while she'd been working 2 jobs to help pay for her mother's medical bills. But the moment passed, as it always did, because reality had teeth and rent was due, and the county didn't accept righteous anger as payment for back taxes. "I apologize if I've disappointed you," Skye said, and she almost believed the apology sounded genuine. "What can I get started for you this evening?" Andy leaned forward, elbows on the table, his blue suit catching the light from the chandelier overhead. "Let me try this again," he said, speaking slowly now, as if to a child or someone with a learning disability. "And really focus this time, okay? Try to keep up." He launched into another stream of Sicilian, or what Skye assumed was Sicilian, though for all she knew he could have been making up half the words. This time he spoke more slowly, over-enunciating each syllable with theatrical precision, pausing between words to give her time to process. The performance was so exaggerated, so dripping with contempt, that several nearby tables had abandoned any pretense of not watching. An older woman at table 14 had actually turned her chair slightly to get a better view. Andy pointed at different items on the menu as he spoke, his finger landing on the various Italian descriptions, his voice rising and falling with exaggerated emphasis. He was clearly enjoying himself immensely, his whole body animated with the pleasure of having found someone to toy with. The woman in the red dress was now openly watching, not even pretending to study her own menu, her expression hovering somewhere between amusement and second-hand embarrassment. When Andy finished his soliloquy, he sat back and spread his hands in a gesture of exaggerated patience. "There, was that clearer? Should I go even slower?" Skye's mind was a blank wall of incomprehension. She'd caught maybe 3 words that sounded vaguely like Italian vocabulary she'd encountered before, something that might have been rosso, and another that could have been formaggio, but stringing them together into any kind of meaningful request was impossible. Her professional composure was fracturing, small cracks appearing in the facade she'd spent nearly a year perfecting. She could feel her cheeks burning, could sense the dangerous prickle of tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. "I'm very sorry," she said, and her voice came out slightly strained despite her best efforts. "I still don't understand. If you could please order in English." Andy laughed, not a polite chuckle or a restrained expression of amusement, but a full-throated laugh that seemed to echo off the high ceilings. He turned to his date, shaking his head with exaggerated disbelief, and when he spoke, his voice was loud enough to carry to at least 3 surrounding tables. "I literally just asked for water," he said, switching to English with obvious relish. "That's it, water. In Sicilian, yes, but it's one of the most basic words in the language, and she's standing there looking at me like I just asked her to explain rocket science." He mimicked Skye's confused expression, his face arranging itself into an exaggerated parody of bewilderment. "This is what passes for premium service at the Obsidian, apparently." The woman in the red dress laughed, a bright, tinkling sound that seemed to release tension she'd been holding. She covered her mouth with her hand, but her shoulders shook with genuine amusement, her eyes crinkling at the corners. "Andy," she said, though there was no reproach in her voice, just delighted shock at his audacity. "I'm serious," Andy continued, warming to his audience. "Water, aqua. It's practically the same in every Romance language, My 5-year-old nephew could figure it out from context clues. He looked back at Sky, his expression shifting to something that could generously be called pity but was really just another flavor of contempt. Do you even know what romance languages are? Or is that also above your pay grade? Sky stood frozen, her pen still hovering over the empty page, her entire body rigid with the effort of not reacting. The tears were closer now, threatening to spill over despite her desperate attempt to hold them back. She could feel the weight of every patron's attention, could sense Vincent somewhere in her peripheral vision, probably calculating whether this had crossed the line into something requiring intervention, or whether it was still within the bounds of normal difficult customer behavior. The worst part wasn't even the humiliation itself. It was the knowledge that Andy was right about one thing. She didn't understand what he was saying. She wasn't educated in the way he was, hadn't had the luxury of semesters abroad or private language tutors. She'd barely graduated from community college while working full-time to support her dying mother. And the idea that this was somehow a personal failing, that her lack of multilingual fluency was evidence of some fundamental inadequacy, made her want to scream. But service workers didn't scream. They smiled and apologized and wrote down orders, and pretended that comments about their intelligence or their shoes or their worth as human beings were just water off a duck's back. "I'll get you water right away," Sky managed, her voice coming out almost steady. "And when you're ready to order your meal in English, I'll be happy to." "See, that's the thing," Andy interrupted, his smile never wavering. "I shouldn't have to order in English. Not at a restaurant that charges these prices and claims to serve authentic Italian cuisine. The fact that you can't understand even basic Sicilian is really a reflection of this establishment's declining standards, wouldn't you say?" He looked at her expectantly, as if waiting for her to agree with her own inadequacy. The woman in the red dress was watching now with less amusement and more of what might have been discomfort, her smile faltering slightly at the edges. But she didn't intervene, didn't tell Andy to stop, didn't do anything except sit there in her expensive dress and bear witness to someone else's dismantling. Sky opened her mouth to respond, though she had no idea what she was going to say. What words could possibly navigate this situation without either getting her fired or giving Andy the satisfaction of seeing her break, when a voice cut through the tension like a blade through silk. It came from table 11. From the corner where Matteo Reeves had been sitting in silence for the past hour. And the voice was speaking Sicilian. Andy's confidence seemed to swell with each passing second of Sky's silence, feeding on her visible discomfort, the way certain predators can smell fear and become emboldened by it. He set his menu down flat on the table, smoothing it with both hands in a gesture that suggested he was preparing for a longer performance, settling in for an extended demonstration of his superiority. The woman in the red dress had gone quiet now, her earlier laughter fading into something more watchful, her champagne clutch held against her stomach like a shield. "You know what I think," Andy said, and Sky recognized the tone immediately. It was the voice of someone who decided that mercy was boring and cruelty was more entertaining. "I think this whole situation is emblematic of a larger problem in American society. We've lost all sense of excellence, all sense of standards. We let people coast through life on bare minimum effort and then act surprised when they can't perform basic functions." He wasn't even looking at her anymore as he spoke. His eyes were on his date, his body angled toward her, but his words were very clearly meant for Sky, meant to be heard by her and absorbed and internalized. It was the particular genius of his cruelty. He could destroy her while technically speaking to someone else, could later claim he was just having a conversation if challenged. "I mean, look at this," Andy continued, gesturing vaguely in Sky's direction without actually meeting her eyes. "We're in a supposedly high-end establishment, the kind of place that charges $45 for an appetizer, and they can't even hire staff who understand the basics of the culture they're supposedly celebrating. It's insulting, really, to the heritage, to the language, to people like me who actually took the time to learn it properly." Sky felt something crack inside her chest, a small fracture in the wall she'd built to contain everything she was feeling. Her notepad was trembling slightly in her hand now, a small betrayal of the composure she was desperately trying to maintain. She could walk away. She should walk away. Find Vincent, explain the situation, ask to be assigned to a different section. But some stubborn part of her, the part that sounded like her mother's voice, telling her never to let anyone make her feel small, kept her rooted in place. Andy picked up his water glass, examined it, then set it down without drinking, another gesture that seemed designed purely to emphasize his control over the situation. "Let me try one more time," he said, his voice taking on that slow, condescending cadence again. "And really, truly concentrate, because I'm about to say something very simple, and if you can't understand it, well..." He let the sentence hang, unfinished, the implications clear enough. He switched back to Sicilian, but this time there was an edge to his voice that hadn't been there before. The words came faster, harder, his tone shifting from theatrical mockery to something sharper. Skye didn't need to understand the language to recognize that the tenor had changed, that whatever he was saying now wasn't about food or water or menu items. This was something else, something meaner. Andy spoke for what felt like a full minute, his voice rising and falling with animated emphasis, his hands gesturing aggressively, one finger occasionally jabbing towards Skye for emphasis. The woman in the red dress had gone very still, her eyes widening slightly, her expression suggesting she might understand more of what was being said than Skye did and wasn't entirely comfortable with it. When Andy finished, he leaned back in his chair with an expression of satisfaction, his arms crossing over his chest. He waited, watching Skye with the expectant air of someone who just delivered what he considered a devastating blow and was now anticipating the reaction. Skye stood there, her mind racing to process what had just happened, to understand the shift in energy. She didn't know the words, but she knew hatred when she heard it. Knew contempt. Knew the particular quality of voice that comes from someone who isn't just trying to embarrass you anymore, but actively wants to hurt you. Her lip trembled, just slightly, just for a second, but it was enough. Andy saw it, his smile widened. "Nothing," he said, switching back to English. "No response. I just told you in very clear Sicilian that you're clearly someone who comes from nothing, who will amount to nothing, and whose presence in this dining room is an insult to everyone who's actually earned their place in society. And you're just going to stand there." The words hung in the air like smoke. Other diners weren't even pretending not to watch anymore. Table 15 had gone completely silent, their silverware frozen midair. The elderly couple at table 9 looked scandalized, the woman's hand pressed to her mouth. Even the sommelier had stopped walking, trapped mid-stride between tables, his wine bottle held at an awkward angle. Skye felt the hot sting of tears finally break through her defenses, felt moisture gathering at the corners of her eyes despite every effort to hold it back. Her throat had closed up completely, making speech impossible even if she'd known what to say. The notepad in her hand suddenly felt impossibly heavy, weighing 1,000 pounds, and the pen might as well have been a sword she didn't know how to wield. $3,000, 4 days, her mother's house. She couldn't do this anymore. The realization hit her with sudden, crystalline clarity. Whatever amount of money she might earn tonight, whatever tips Andy might theoretically leave, though she suspected it would be nothing, or worse, a deliberately insulting $1, it wasn't worth this. Wasn't worth standing here being verbally eviscerated while an audience of wealthy strangers watched and did nothing. Wasn't worth the particular flavor of helplessness that came from knowing you had no power, no recourse, no option except to absorb every blow and smile and say, "Yes, sir," and "I apologize, sir," and pretend your humanity wasn't being stripped away layer by layer. Her mother would understand. Her mother, who'd worked in hospitals for 30 years and dealt with doctors who treated nurses like they were furniture, would absolutely understand the decision Skye was about to make. Would probably have made it herself years ago. Would have told Skye that no amount of money was worth letting someone treat her like she was less than human. Skye closed her notepad slowly, the small snap of the cover meeting the pages sounding unnaturally loud in the sudden quiet of the dining room. She tucked it back into her apron pocket along with the pen. Her hands were shaking visibly now, and she didn't even try to hide it. "I apologize," she said, and her voice came out rough, catching on the tears she was fighting. I need to, I'll send someone else to take your order. She started to turn away, preparing to walk directly to Vincent's office, to hand him her apron, to clock out and leave this place forever. The foreclosure could happen. The house could be sold. She could find somewhere else to live. Some way to survive that didn't require her to stand still, while entitled men treated her like target practice for their cruelty. But she only made it half a step before that voice came again from table 11. The voice that had interrupted once already. The voice that belonged to Matteo Reeves. And this time, the voice wasn't just speaking Sicilian. It was speaking with an authority that made the chandelier crystals seem to tremble, that made the ambient noise of the dining room drop to absolute silence, that carried the weight of something ancient and absolute, and completely uninterested in Andy Mast's opinion about anything. The voice spoke 3 sentences in rapid succession, each word crystal clear, each syllable perfectly pronounced with the fluency of someone who'd learned the language not from a semester abroad but from birth, from blood, from heritage that ran deeper than Andy's expensive suit could ever reach. Skye didn't understand the words, but she understood their effect. Andy's face had gone white. The woman in the red dress had set down her clutch and was gripping the edge of the table with both hands, her knuckles pale against the white tablecloth. And every staff member in the visible portion of the dining room had frozen in place, their collective expression suggesting they'd just witnessed the moment before an avalanche, when the snow is still hanging in the air and nobody knows quite where it's going to land, but everyone knows it's going to be catastrophic. Matteo Reeves stood up from his table, his chair scraping back with deliberate slowness, and the sound seemed to echo like thunder. The voice that came from table 11 didn't rise in volume. It didn't need to. It cut through the ambient noise of the obsidian the way a knife cuts through water, effortlessly, completely, leaving silence in its wake. The words were Sicilian, that much was clear from the cadence and the rolling consonants, but where Andy's delivery had been performative and slightly uncertain, Matteo's was something else entirely. It carried the weight of legitimacy, of fluency so natural it sounded less like a language being spoken and more like the language speaking through him. Matteo remained seated for the first 3 words, his posture relaxed, almost casual. His right hand still rested near his whiskey glass, though his fingers had gone completely still. His left arm draped over the back of the empty chair beside him. But his eyes, those dark, predatory eyes that had been conducting surveillance of the room all evening, had locked onto Andy with the focused intensity of a scope zeroing in on a target. The first sentence he spoke was brief, maybe 5 words, delivered in a tone so flat and cold it seemed to lower the temperature of the entire dining room by several degrees. Even without understanding the language, Skye could hear the correction in it, the way a teacher might correct a student who just butchered a pronunciation so badly it was almost offensive. Andy's face, which had been flushed with the satisfaction of his performance, went through a series of rapid color changes, pink to red to white, as the meaning of what he just heard processed through his brain. His mouth opened slightly, then closed. His hands, which had been gesturing with such confidence moments before, dropped to the table and went still. Matteo spoke again, this time at greater length. His voice carried across the dining room with preternatural clarity, each syllable precisely articulated, the dialect flowing from his mouth with the ease of someone who'd spoken it since childhood. There was something musical about the way the words connected, a rhythm that suggested this wasn't vocabulary memorized from textbooks, but language absorbed through years of conversation, of listening to grandmothers tell stories, of learning curses and prayers in equal measure. And then he did something that made several of the staff members visibly flinch. He repeated 2 of the words Andy had used earlier in his ordering attempts. Skye recognized them by their similar sounds, even though she still didn't know their meanings, but pronounced them differently. The correction was subtle but unmistakable, the difference between someone who'd learned a word from a recording and someone who knew how it was supposed to sound when spoken by actual Sicilians in actual Sicily. The first word, which Skye guessed was wine based on context, Andy had pronounced with the emphasis on the second syllable, The vowel sound slightly too open, too American. Matteo repeated it with the emphasis shifted, the vowel compressed, a slight rasp to the final consonant that made it sound completely different. The second word, bread, maybe, or something related to it, Andy had pronounced almost like it was Italian, with a soft rolling of the R and a melodic lilt. Matteo's version was harder, more guttural, the R harsh and brief, the ending consonant sharp enough to cut. It was the difference between a tourist saying croissant and a Parisian saying it, but magnified, weaponized, turned into an audio demonstration of exactly how far from authentic Andy's semester abroad had left him. The woman in the red dress made a small sound, something between a gasp and a whimper, and her hand moved from the table to her throat in an unconscious gesture of alarm. Matteo wasn't finished. He continued speaking, his voice taking on a conversational quality that was somehow more terrifying than if he'd been shouting. The words poured out in a steady stream, unhurried, each phrase landing with the precision of a surgeon making incisions. He wasn't just speaking Sicilian. He was demonstrating mastery of it, showing everyone in the room that whatever Andy had been doing earlier was a pale imitation, a child's crayon drawing next to a Renaissance painting. Skye found herself transfixed despite her confusion, despite the tears still threatening at the corners of her eyes, despite the fact that she'd been preparing to walk away from this job forever just moments ago. There was something hypnotic about watching Matteo speak, about seeing the way his mouth shaped the words with casual precision, the way his body remained utterly still except for the minimal movements required for speech. He looked like violence in repose, like a weapon that had decided to have a conversation before deciding whether to fire. Other diners had turned in their chairs now, abandoning any pretense of privacy or propriety. This was a scene, a spectacle, the kind of thing that people would talk about later at cocktail parties and business lunches. "You'll never believe what happened at the Obsidian last Thursday." The elderly woman at table 9 had her hand pressed to her chest, her eyes wide. The business dinner at table 6 had come to a complete halt, 4 men in suits sitting frozen with their forks halfway to their mouths. Ramon, the senior server who'd taken Matteo's order earlier, had materialized near the service station, his face carefully blank but his body language screaming tension. He caught Skye's eye briefly, and the look he gave her was equal parts warning and sympathy. Whatever was happening here, it was going to have consequences. The only question was for whom. Matteo reached the end of whatever he was saying and paused, letting the silence stretch for 3 beats. Then he spoke one more time, just a handful of words, his tone shifting from conversational to something that sounded almost curious, as if he were asking a question. But the words came out colored with such obvious contempt that everyone in earshot understood this wasn't really a question at all. It was a challenge. Andy's throat moved as he swallowed hard. A thin sheen of sweat had appeared on his forehead, catching the light from the chandelier above. His hands, still resting on the white tablecloth, had curled into loose fists. The woman in the red dress had shifted her chair slightly away from him, a subtle but noticeable repositioning that suggested she was recalculating her association with whatever was about to happen. For a long moment, nobody moved. The entire dining room seemed to be holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next, whether Andy would respond or retreat, whether this confrontation would escalate or dissolve. Then Matteo stood up. The movement was unhurried, deliberate, the scrape of his chair against the floor somehow louder than it should have been in the acoustic space. He was tall. Skye hadn't fully registered that when he'd been sitting, but standing he had at least 4 inches on Andy, maybe more. The unbuttoned shirt revealed more of the tattoos as he moved, the ink seeming to shift and flow across his skin in the low light. The blazer hung open, framing rather than concealing him, and there was something about the casualness of his partial undress that made him seem more dangerous rather than less. As if he couldn't be bothered to follow rules, because rules simply didn't apply to him. He picked up his whiskey glass, drained the remaining amber liquid in one smooth motion, and set it back down on the table with a soft clink that somehow carried across the entire room. Then he looked directly at Andy, his dark eyes holding contact with an intensity that made several people shift uncomfortably in their seats. And he switched to English. "Your pronunciation," Matteo said, his voice carrying a slight accent now that it hadn't when he was speaking Sicilian, Italian inflections coloring the English words, making them sound almost musical despite the flatness of his tone, is embarrassing. Vinu is not vino. Pani is not pain. You speak like an American who spent 6 weeks pretending to be European. He took a single step toward Andy's table, closing maybe 3 feet of distance, but somehow making it feel like he'd crossed the entire room. And you speak it badly, with the confidence of ignorance. Andy's mouth opened, but no sound came out. He looked like a man who just realized he'd wandered into the wrong neighborhood and was only now understanding exactly how lost he was. Matteo's lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Should I continue in Sicilian?" he asked, his tone suggesting this was a genuine offer. "Or would you prefer I translate for your date, since she seems confused about whether she should be here at all?" Andy's face had gone from white to a splotchy red that started at his collar and crept up his neck like rising water. His mouth worked silently for a moment, opening and closing, his brain clearly struggling to formulate a response to a situation he'd never anticipated encountering. Men like Andy Mast didn't get challenged. They certainly didn't get challenged by people who looked like Matteo Reeves, people whose visible tattoos and unbuttoned shirts should have placed them firmly in a category Andy could dismiss and forget. "I don't know who you think you are," Andy finally managed, his voice coming out higher than he probably intended, strained with the effort of maintaining any semblance of control. "But this is a private conversation, and you have no right to." "I know exactly who I am," Matteo interrupted, his English carrying that slight Mediterranean accent that made even simple words sound weighted with meaning. "The question is whether you know who you are, or perhaps more importantly, whether you know where you are." He took another step closer to Andy's table, and the movement was so controlled, so deliberately measured, that it seemed choreographed. His hands remained loose at his sides, no threatening gestures, nothing that could be pointed to later as overtly aggressive. But his physical presence alone was enough to make Andy shrink back slightly in his chair, a reflexive response to proximity with something dangerous. "This restaurant," Matteo continued, his voice never rising above conversational volume but somehow carrying to every corner of the room, "belongs to me. I own it. The tables, the chairs, the glasses you're drinking from, the air you're breathing, all mine. Which means the woman you've been humiliating for the past 10 minutes. She works for me." The statement landed like a physical blow. Andy's eyes widened, his head turning sharply toward Vincent, who stood near the host podium with an expression that confirmed everything Matteo had just said. The general manager gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, his face carefully neutral but his body language suggesting he wished he were anywhere else in the world right now. Skye felt her own surprise register as a sharp intake of breath. Matteo Reeves on the obsidian. The man with the tattoos and the half-unbuttoned shirt, the one Vincent had warned the staff to handle with discretion, wasn't just a dangerous guest, he was their employer. Or at least, he owned the establishment that employed them. The revelation recontextualized everything about his presence here tonight, the way the staff had moved around him with such careful attention, the way Ramon had approached his order like he was defusing a bomb. "I don't believe you," Andy said, but the conviction had drained from his voice, replaced by something that sounded uncomfortably close to fear. "Richard Mast owns half the properties in this city. I would know if—" "Richard Mast owns half the properties he hasn't bankrupted yet," Matteo said, and now there was something cold and precise in his tone, the voice of someone delivering information they knew to be accurate because they'd made it their business to know. "Your father's development company is carrying $400 million in debt. The waterfront project he broke ground on last year, 3 months behind schedule and hemorrhaging money. The luxury condos in Brooklyn. 52% vacancy rate, because he priced them for a market that doesn't exist." Andy's face had gone pale again, the red flush draining away as quickly as it had appeared. His hands gripped the edge of the table, knuckles white against the cloth. Matteo wasn't finished. The only reason Richard Mast still has his name on buildings is because the banks haven't foreclosed yet. They will, probably within the year. And when they do, men like me will buy those properties for pennies on the dollar, tear your father's name off the facades, and replace them with something more deserving." He paused, letting that sink in, his dark eyes never leaving Andy's face. "So when you sit in my restaurant and act like you own the world, understand that you don't. You own nothing. You are the son of a man who is drowning in his own hubris, and you are following him into the water with a smile on your face." The woman in the red dress had gone completely still, her champagne clutch forgotten on the table, her eyes fixed on some point in the middle distance, as if she were calculating exactly how quickly she could extract herself from this situation. Her earlier amusement had evaporated entirely, replaced by the visible discomfort of someone who'd realized she'd bet on the wrong horse, and the race wasn't even over yet. "You don't know what you're talking about," Andy said, but the words came out weak, defensive, lacking any real conviction. "My father's company is—" "Your father's company filed for Chapter 11 protection on 2 subsidiary LLCs last month," Matteo said, his voice cutting through Andy's protest like a blade through paper. "It was kept quiet. Sealed filings, favorable judges, the kind of maneuvers money can buy. But money doesn't buy silence from everyone. Some people see these things. Some people make it their business to know when empires are crumbling." He took one more step, close enough now that he was standing at the edge of Andy's table, looking down at the seated man with an expression that managed to convey both contempt and boredom, as if Andy weren't even worth the effort of this conversation, but Matteo was having it anyway out of principle. "You came into my establishment," Matteo said, his voice dropping lower, taking on an edge that made Sky's skin prickle with instinctive alarm. "And you decided to entertain yourself by degrading someone who works harder in a single shift than you've worked in your entire privileged life. You thought speaking a language she doesn't know made you superior. You thought your father's money he's currently losing, by the way, gave you the right to treat her like she's beneath you." Andy tried to stand, his chair scraping back, but Matteo's hand came down on the table between them, not touching Andy, not threatening him overtly, but placed with such deliberate precision that Andy froze halfway out of his seat, caught between standing and sitting, looking ridiculous and scared in equal measure. "Sit down," Matteo said, and it wasn't a request. Andy sat. "You wear expensive clothes," Matteo continued, his eyes traveling over Andy's blue suit with obvious disdain. "You speak languages you learned in classrooms from teachers who probably mocked your accent when you left the room. You order in Sicilian like you think it makes you cultured, but you pronounce words like a tourist reading from a phrase book. You are a costume wearing a man, not a man wearing a costume." The phrase hung in the air, and Sky saw Andy flinch as if he'd been slapped. "You have a rich man's clothes," Matteo said, each word dropping like a stone into still water, "and a poor man's manners, which tells me everything I need to know about what you actually are underneath all that expensive wool. Nothing. You are nothing dressed up as something." The woman in the red dress stood abruptly, her chair scraping back with enough force to draw every eye in the room. She grabbed her clutch from the table, her movements jerky with poorly concealed panic. "I need to use the restroom," she said, her voice tight. And then she was walking, almost running, toward the back of the restaurant, her heels clicking rapidly against the marble floor. She wasn't coming back. Everyone in the room knew it. Andy watched her go, his face a mask of humiliation and impotent rage. When he looked back at Matteo, there was something desperate in his expression, a last-ditch attempt to salvage some scrap of dignity from this disaster. "You can't talk to me like this," Andy said, his voice cracking slightly on the words. "Do you know who my father is? What he could do to your business?" Matteo smiled then, and it was the most terrifying expression Sky had ever seen on a human face. All teeth, no warmth, the smile of a predator that had stopped pretending to be anything else. "Your father," Matteo said slowly, "owes money to people who owe money to me, which means, in the way these things actually work in this city, your father works for me. He just doesn't know it yet." He leaned down slightly, bringing his face closer to Andy's level. "And now you know it. So when you go home tonight, and you are going home, right now, immediately, you can tell Richard that Matteo Reeves says hello. Tell him I'm looking forward to our inevitable meeting when his empire finishes collapsing, and he comes looking for a loan he'll never be able to repay. He straightened up, his hand lifting from the table, giving Andy permission to leave without actually saying the words. "You have 30 seconds to get out of my restaurant," Matteo said, his voice returning to that flat, emotionless tone. "After that, I make a phone call, and your father's bankruptcy proceedings become significantly more complicated. Your choice." Andy Mast moved like a man who just discovered the ground beneath his feet wasn't solid, that what he'd thought was marble was actually thin ice, and he'd been skating on it all evening without realizing the danger. He stood with such jerky, uncoordinated haste that his chair toppled backward, hitting the floor with a crash that made half the dining room flinch. His hands scrambled for his phone and wallet on the table, his fingers clumsy with adrenaline or fear or both, nearly knocking over his water glass in the process. His mouth opened as if he wanted to say something, some parting shot, some threat, some final attempt to salvage his dignity. But when he looked at Matteo's face, whatever words he'd been forming died in his throat. Instead, he grabbed his belongings and turned toward the exit, his movements so hasty they bordered on flight. The blue suit that had looked so sharp and powerful when he'd entered now seemed like camouflage that had failed, a disguise that had been stripped away to reveal the frightened man underneath. He made it 3 steps before apparently remembering he'd arrived with someone. His head swiveled toward the back hallway where the woman in the red dress had disappeared, and for a moment he seemed caught between going after her and getting out of the restaurant before Matteo's 30-second deadline expired. Self-preservation won. He turned back toward the entrance and resumed his retreat, weaving between tables with none of the confident swagger he'd displayed earlier. Other diners watched him go with expressions ranging from fascination to second-hand embarrassment, their conversations suspended in favor of witnessing the conclusion of whatever this was. Vincent appeared near the host stand as if summoned, already holding Andy's coat, black cashmere, probably worth more than Sky's monthly rent, extended at arm's length like an offering to a deity he hoped wouldn't smite him for being associated with this disaster. Andy snatched it without acknowledging Vincent's existence and pushed through the heavy glass doors out into the November night, the cold air rushing in briefly before the door swung shut behind him. The silence that followed his departure was profound, the kind of quiet that feels heavy with unspoken words and suppressed reactions. Then, slowly, like someone had pressed play after a pause, the ambient noise of the restaurant resumed. Conversations restarted in hushed tones. Silverware clinked against china. A woman at table 14 laughed, too loud and too sudden, her nerves releasing in the only way they knew how. The woman in the red dress emerged from the back hallway approximately 90 seconds later, her clutch held against her chest, her earlier confidence completely evaporated. She scanned the dining room with wide eyes, registered that Andy was gone, and the visible relief that crossed her face was almost comical. She made her own exit without bothering to collect whatever coat she might have checked, her heels clicking a rapid staccato rhythm toward freedom. Vincent held the door for her with professional courtesy, as if this were a normal departure rather than someone fleeing a social apocalypse. Matteo watched her go with the same detached interest he might give to birds flying past a window. Then he turned, his dark eyes scanning the dining room until they found Sky, who'd remained frozen near Andy's abandoned table, her notepad still clutched in her hand, her mind struggling to process everything that had just happened in the span of maybe 5 minutes. "You," Matteo said, not loud but clear enough to carry. "Come here." It wasn't a request, but unlike when Andy had commanded her presence, there was something different in Matteo's tone, not kindness exactly, but the absence of contempt. The difference between being summoned by someone who saw you as furniture and being called over by someone who simply expected to be listened to. Sky's feet moved before her brain fully engaged, carrying her across the dining room toward table 11, where Matteo had returned to his seat. He'd settled back into his chair with the same casual grace he'd displayed all evening, as if the past few minutes of verbal demolition had been nothing more than a minor interruption to his meal. His whiskey glass was empty, his plate cleared except for the geometric arrangement of knife and fork that indicated he'd finished. She approached slowly, her professional training warring with her complete uncertainty about what was expected of her in this situation. When she reached his table, she stopped at what felt like an appropriate distance, close enough to hear him, far enough to maintain the server-customer boundary that her job required. Matteo looked up at her, his expression unreadable. Up close, the tattoos were even more intricate than she'd noticed from across the room, the inkwork so detailed it seemed to shift and move in the low light. His eyes were darker than they'd appeared from a distance, almost black, and they studied her with an intensity that made her acutely aware of every aspect of her appearance. Her wrinkled apron, her scuffed shoes, the tear tracks she could feel drying on her cheeks. "How much do you need?" he asked. The question was so unexpected, so divorced from anything Skye had anticipated, that she could only stare at him in confusion. "I'm sorry." "The house," Matteo said, his voice patient but firm, as if he were asking her to repeat an order he hadn't quite caught. "The foreclosure. The notice in your locker that's been eating at you all night. How much do you need to stop it?" Skye felt her breath catch in her throat. Her mind raced, trying to understand how he could possibly know about that, about the envelope she'd tucked into her street clothes downstairs, about the deadline that had been haunting her every waking moment. She hadn't told anyone. Vincent didn't know. The other servers didn't know. It was her private disaster, her personal failure. I didn't. The words tumbled out incoherently. "You keep touching your apron pocket," Matteo said, and now there was something almost gentle in his voice, though it still carried that underlying edge of someone who expected honest answers. "Every few minutes, checking it's still there. And you walk like someone whose shoes hurt but who can't afford new ones. And you looked at that man like someone who needs this job so badly that you'd let him destroy you rather than risk losing it." He paused. "I've seen that look before, many times. So I'm asking, how much?" Skye's throat had closed up entirely. She managed to force out the number in a voice that sounded like it belonged to someone else. $3,000 by Monday morning. Matteo nodded once, as if she'd confirmed something he'd already suspected. He reached into the inside pocket of his blazer and pulled out a leather wallet so worn it looked like it might be older than Skye was. He opened it, and even from her position she could see it was full of cash, crisp bills in various denominations, more money than she'd ever seen someone carry on their person. But instead of pulling out bills, he reached behind them and extracted an envelope. White, standard size, sealed. He set it on the table between them and slid it toward her with 2 fingers. 4,000, he said. 3 for the house, 1 for new shoes and whatever else you need. Skye stared at the envelope like it might explode. "I can't. You don't have to. I mean, that's incredibly generous, but I couldn't possibly." "You can," Matteo interrupted, his tone suggesting this wasn't up for debate. "And you will. Consider it an investment in staff morale, or call it compensation for emotional distress caused by a customer in my establishment. Or don't call it anything and just take it." He pushed the envelope another inch closer to her. "I don't make offers twice." Her hand trembled as she reached for the envelope, her fingers brushing against the paper that represented salvation, that represented keeping her mother's house, keeping the memories, keeping the last physical connection she had to the woman who'd raised her alone. The weight of it in her hand felt impossible, like she was holding something far more substantial than paper and ink. "Thank you," she whispered, and the words were completely inadequate for what she was feeling. "I don't know how to. I'll pay you back. I promise I'll work extra shifts. No," Matteo said, his voice firm. "You won't pay me back. What you'll do is learn something." He leaned forward slightly, his dark eyes holding hers with an intensity that made it impossible to look away. "That man treated you like garbage because you let him, because you stood there and took it and smiled and apologized for existing. And I understand why. You need this job. You need the money. You have things hanging over your head that make you willing to absorb abuse rather than fight back." He paused, making sure she was listening, really listening. "But silence is for the weak," he continued, his accent thickening slightly on the words, giving them additional weight. "For people who have no power and no options, you have both. You just didn't know it yet." He gestured vaguely toward the door Andy had fled through. "Next time someone like that sits in your section and decides to make you into entertainment, you don't stand there taking it. You don't wait for someone else to intervene. You tell them to leave. And if they don't leave, you come find me or Vincent or whoever is in charge, and you make them leave. Skye nodded, not trusting herself to speak, the envelope clutched against her chest like a talisman. Mateo sat back in his chair, the conversation apparently over in his mind. Go clock out, take the rest of the night off. Go home, handle your business with the house. His expression softened almost imperceptibly. And buy some shoes that don't hurt.